Hey, how you doing? It is I, the Terrorific Lady, otherwise known as Brandy, and welcome to Retro Horror School and the happiest of Fridays to you. Did anyone else get confused by the fact if you were off work on Monday because of Memorial Day, like being a day, a day behind this entire week? I know I have, but hey, it's already the weekend, and I hope you have a good one. Now, on to today's video. I've been doing a little short series about horror subgenres 101, where I've talked about the history of the subgenre, a bit about the characteristics, and some examples of movies from that subgenre. I've already talked about slashers. I've talked about the gore subgenre of horror, and now we're going to get into the mind-bendy kind of horror, the psychological horror. If you haven't seen the other two videos about slashers and gory horror, I highly recommend you checking them out because the format of this video is gonna follow the format of today's video. Psychological films have been unnerving people for forever with its focus on unseen and psychological threats. And even though I usually talk about the 70s up through the 2010s, so that's my wheelhouse, psychological horror can even be seen earlier than that if you go all the way back to the 1920s and the film The Cabinet of Dr. Cagliari. This film explored the themes of madness and delusion. In the 1960s, then you had Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which paved the way and changed the game for psychological horror going forward with its twists and its tension building. In the 70s, you had films like The Exorcist, which tapped into fears of the unknown and the unseen, and these fears wreaking havoc on not only the person experiencing them, but the people around them as well. With the 80s, you had films like The Shining, which delved brilliantly into one man's descent into madness and paranoia, as well as the impact of isolation. Then going on into the 90s, you had films that continued to explore deep psychological themes. Jacob's Ladder delved into the trauma and hallucinations of a Vietnam War veteran, while the film Seven depicted a very gritty narrative about a serial killer. In the 2000s, psychological horror evolved yet again with films like American Psycho, which gave a satirization of hustle culture through the lens of a very, very crazy protagonist, and the others, which use psychological atmospheric tension and a twist ending to leave a lasting impact. Then in the 2010s, psychological horror evolved yet again to explore the fragility of the human mind with films like Shutter Island and Black Swan. And then towards the end of the decade, you have what I like to call the era of A24 psychological horror films, with films like Hereditary and Midsommar, which combines psychological atmospheric tension with kind of artsy art house aesthetics. Now, let's go over what makes a psychological horror film a psychological horror film. So what are the characteristics of films in this subgenre? First, there's a strong focus on mental states to unsettle, unnerve, and disturb the audience. Think of the way that the Babadook uses grief and how it explores those themes pertaining to grief and mental illness. Psychological horror films also tend to play with unreliable realities and unreliable narrators. It leaves you questioning what is real and what is not, again, in films like Shutter Island. Also with psychological horror, there tends to be a very slow build of tension. So if you look at a film like Hereditary, it doesn't come straight out of the gate. It slowly kind of starts a little bit of fire, which builds up in intensity and intensity until bam. And this buildup constantly keeps you on the edge of your seat. Psychological horror also likes to delve into issues like madness, mental instability, paranoia, and identity crisis. Black Swan is a good example of this, where it shows a dancer's of reality and mental state slowly breaking down. Psychological horror, also a big hallmark of it is that it often lacks clear resolutions or clear endings. It is purposely ambiguous. Take, for instance, The Witch. It is a bit of an ambiguous ending because, what happened and why is it happening? And it just leaves you questioning things long after the movie is over. Finally, psychological films focus a lot on characters' emotions, perceptions, and reactions to certain situations. A film like The Strangers greatly focuses on the fear that this couple is experiencing because of these three people who are after them for reasons unknown. And the end of the movie doesn't really explain it either. So now, just like the other subgenres that I talked about, psychological horror has its own different bouquet of smells and flavors. Let's break down the different subgenres within the subgenre of psychological horror. First up, you have home invasion horror, which focuses on the fear of someone's safety being invaded. These films play on the fear of someone being attacked in their own home and the psychological state of you feeling safe is broken down in these kinds of horror movies. Funny Games is an example of a home invasion horror where a family is terrorized by intruders with foul nefarious intentions. Next up, Madness and Paranoia, which is about like it sounds. It focuses on a character who is slowly losing their grip on reality. They're losing their sanity. They do not know really what's what anymore. A good example of this, as I mentioned before, is Black Swan. Next, you have The Phobia and Isolation, which again is about like it sounds. It taps into people's fears of being isolated and cut off from society and how that isolation can affect you. The main focus in these types of movies is also on survival. More often than not, the main characters don't survive, and if they do, they usually end up paying a very heavy price. Incidents in the Ghostland is a good example of this kind of psychological horror. And last but not least, you have art house horror, which focuses on psychological themes and atmosphere. The core of the film is centered on those visuals and the cinematography as a very distinct style and can delve into ideas that, in a sense, challenge the viewer's beliefs. Panos Cosmatos' Mandy is a great example of this. Beautifully striking visuals and delving into the themes of revenge and can people just take what they want without any consequences. Every film I talked about, I highly recommend, by the way. And that's it. That is a delving into psychological horror. So my question for you is, what is your favorite psychological horror film? What's your favorite mind-bendy spooky film? Let me know in the comments below. You know where to catch me on Instagram and Threads at Terrorific Lady. And sadly, class is dismissed, everybody. But I will see you next time. Bye.